majesty. Praise for. Now you get that in my head. Thank you. Thank you. It's all right, actually. It's if you're gonna have a song in your head, that's as good a one as you're gonna find. I don't want that blocking the. Anybody know if we're live? Yes. All right. Well, let's assume that we're live. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to ABF Part 2. My apologies, first of all, to those of you who were watching me last Sunday, and I got very unceremoniously cut off. That was not the fault of the camera operator. That was my fault for not sticking to my allotted time. I went over, like I normally do in ABF, about 2.5 minutes, and you did not get to hear the end of our final description of foreshadowing using names. And so I thought what I would do, for those of you that felt like, you know what, you really kind of got shafted out of kind of hearing the punchline, so to speak, I'm going to start off there, and then we're going to move ahead into our next set of notes. I believe our next set of notes are on our website, fbchh.org, if you want to be toggling over to our website while I'm finishing this up. And if you go to the Resources tab, which is on the far right, and you go down, you'll see a little tab for ABF notes. You click on that, and it should pop up a PDF for you so that you can follow along with the lesson that I'm going to be working on from just a minute. But let me finish this up right here. If you remember, we were talking about David, and we were talking about the fact that David's life is a really interesting character study, because from the time he's introduced as a shepherd boy, when Saul needs somebody to soothe the savage beast, so to speak, when he's being terrorized by the demonic spirit from God, he can't do anything wrong. Like, everything he does succeeds. Like, he attacks a 9.5-foot giant and somehow he wins without even picking up a sword. Like, every battle he goes into, he wins, and it's overwhelming. And Israel's enemies are being defeated left and right, and it's all because of this shepherd boy. Even when the king turns against him and sends him off into the wilderness, he ends up assembling this mighty men, this army of crazy warriors from all over the known world, and he assembles this elite fighting team the world had not seen probably up until that point, which is a big reason why Israel's influence expands. He becomes the king, and everybody's like, yay. There's a civil war that we don't ever hardly talk about when David first takes over, and he just kind of cleans through all of Saul's descendants, and he takes his spot on the throne, and things are going great, and everything's going well, and God is blessing, and it seems like everything's going great. And then the Bathsheba incident happens, and everything after that is a story about how David starts to climb, and I should say slide down the cliff, right? All of the incredible accomplishments of the first 2/3 of his life all come crashing to an end in the last third of his life. And the big question from the Bathsheba incident onward is this: who is going to replace David as king? Because remember, Saul's kids didn't survive long enough to take their place on the throne after Saul, right? David's not a part of that dynasty. He married into Saul's family, but he never produced an heir through that line. And so David is an outsider who's come and sort of grabbed the kingship for himself. And now the question is going to be who's going to take over? Like, is it going to be some other person that sort of sweeps away all of David's family and starts over? Or even within David's family, who's it going to be? Because unfortunately, David followed the practice of many pagan kings around him by having many wives. His many wives produced a variety of heirs. And again, in a world where the mortality death rate is pretty high, you need to kind of cover your bases. So, like, you can't count, I suppose one way of looking at it is you can't count on just one woman to survive long enough to produce a male heir. Let's kind of, try as many as possible, and hopefully we'll get one or two viable heirs that will be able to take over after me. So anyway, that's the thinking process that David has fallen into. And we find out in 2 Samuel chapter 3, we have a listing of all of David's sons in order. And the first four, you have a guy by the name of Amnon, is his firstborn apparently. There's Chileab, and I kind of drew a line through him last week because Chileab's the guy nobody talks about, all right? He never really shows up ever again. I'm not sure why. I don't know if maybe he was just like the Fredo in the family that just, had no chance of taking over the family business. I don't know. I don't know if he maybe died young. I don't know. But Chileab never really appears again. He's sort of out of the picture. Then there's this guy named Absalom, and then there's number 4 is Adonijah, and then there's like 5, 6, 7 that were born to David before he even became king in Jerusalem over the entire country. Then he has several more kids, including Bathsheba, this woman with whom he committed adultery. There was the initial child that was born, and that child died as a judgment from God for their sin. But then there's another child that is born almost not immediately afterwards, obviously, but within a year or two after that, you have another child that is born, and that child is Solomon. Right? We know about Solomon, and we sort of know how the story ends, right? He's the one that eventually takes over for David. But he is not the firstborn, the secondborn, the thirdborn, the fourthborn. He is at the very earliest, the 9th-born son of David. Okay? So there's really no logical reason why he should be the one that's going to take over for David. It just doesn't make any sense. You start at the top with the oldest, and you work your way down through the system. And in fact, when you read the narratives, that's exactly what happens. The very first person who has pretensions to the throne is a guy by the name of Amnon. All right? He wants to be the next king. But here's the problem. He violates his sister, I should say his half-sister, and in the process makes son number 3 very, very angry because he violated his sister. And so what does Absalom do? Absalom concocts a really clever, you could say, I guess, in a very sinister kind of way, a sinister plan to kill Amnon. So Amnon gets eliminated like right away. And he gets eliminated by number 3. And all of a sudden the pecking order, right, shifts. Now Amnon and Chileab are out of the picture. So now the answer is, who's going to be the next king? Is it Absalom? And in fact, what is the very next series of stories in 2 Samuel? The next series of stories is about how Absalom conspires with some of the key leaders in David's administration to steal the kingdom away from David and force him to run in and hide out in the middle of the wilderness, right? To go on the run. And for a long time, it looks like Absalom is the answer, that he's going to rip the kingdom away from David, and that in part, that's going to be a judgment to David for all that David had done wrong with the Bathsheba situation. Okay? So it looks like Absalom's going to be the king that's next. And you go, oh, okay. Then something happens to Absalom, if you remember the story. David fights back with his mighty men because they're no strangers to the wilderness. They went out to the wilderness to regroup. They knew how to fight that way. And they come back and they make quick work of Absalom and his army once everything sort of settles down and they kind of get their feet underneath them. And they're not dealing with the element of surprise. And then Absalom, right, gets killed by Joab, David's commander. And so now we're down to son number 4. And when David becomes an old man, senile, lying in bed shivering, needing somebody to cuddle with him just to keep him warm, he's pretty much, he's off, he's like, he's not really doing any ruling anymore. Adonijah decides it's time. Dad is obviously over the hill. Dad is obviously doesn't know what's going on. I'm the next in line. I should take over. And so he throws this little banquet with Joab and some of the other key members of the administration, and they're about to proclaim him king. Well, Solomon's mama finds out that this is happening. And she goes to David, and apparently David can come through the cobwebs enough to see what's going on. And he says, didn't you promise me that my son was going to be the next king? How is it that Adonijah is proclaiming himself king right now? And so they have this rival. It's really funny. It's almost like, you're having two competing parties going on at the same time. And the question is, which one of the parties is going to be real? It would be like if we had the election in November and both Donald Trump and whoever the Democrats roll out there decide to have victory parties at the exact same time. And then the question is, okay, so which one are the people going to follow, right? And in the end, Solomon proves to be the wiser politician. He kind of cuts Adonijah out of the picture, and he takes the throne, right? After some scheming and so on. And then eventually Adonijah tries to tries to take the kingdom back, or at least starts to make moves towards taking the kingdom back from his brother. And Solomon goes, you had your chance, buddy. And he kills Adonijah too. And so then Solomon consolidates his power, and we finally get the answer to the question, who will replace David? That's what happens if you take the long route of actually reading through all these stories. However, this gets to the point I'm trying to make about foreshadowing. The storyteller, it's not that he doesn't want you to read all the stories. Obviously, he wants you to read all the stories. That's why he put them there. He wants you to go through it and find out how it happens. But he leaves and he drops a hint early on in the story about how this is going to play out. And it's actually found in 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel chapter 12. This is right after the sin with Bathsheba, the death of the first child that came from David and Bathsheba in judgment for David and Bathsheba's sin. And then immediately after that, we get these two verses. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went into her and lay with her, and she bore a son. And he called his name Solomon. Now the he there is David. David, that is verse 24. 2 Samuel 12:24. The he called his name Solomon is David. So Solomon is the name David picked for his son. And Solomon, I think, if you do the translation, means man of peace, which becomes a foreshadowing, too, of his life, right? That David is the man of war, and Solomon kind of comes in after that, doesn't fight a lot of wars, but he consolidates power and makes everything super beautiful and financial prosperity and economic, He's the man of peace while David is the man of war. That's also foreshadowing of his future. But then we get this really interesting verse 25. Verse 25, and the Lord loved him. Well, that's the end of verse 24. And the Lord loved him and sent a message by Nathan the prophet. So he called his name what? What does it say? Jedediah. No, this is not the Beverly Hillbillies here, okay? Jedediah is probably where the Beverly Hillbillies got the idea. Jedediah, and it says this, he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. Well, when you look at what Jedediah means, it means beloved of Yahweh. God had a nickname for Solomon from the time that Solomon was born. This is before Amnon dies. This is before Gilead just gets ignored by everybody. This is before Absalom tries to take over the kingdom and dies. This is before Adonijah is on the scene. And this is while all of these guys are still in play. There is at least 8 people between Solomon and the throne. And it looks incredibly unlikely that the woman who David had an affair with to produce this boy, he seems like the least likely candidate to have the kind of gravitas and support from the nation, right? To rule the country. And yet, the storyteller is giving us this hint, Jedediah, how does God feel about this kid? God loves him. And in the Bible, love and choice, choosing someone, are always connected. The Bible says, if you remember the story of Jacob and Esau, it says, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Now, what does that mean? That God, when Esau was born, God looked at Esau and just like, I don't like that kid. No, that's not the idea of it. The idea is that love represents a choice. I'm choosing Jacob. I'm not choosing Esau, or I'm rejecting Esau. So when you're beloved of Yahweh, your name is Jed, and God gave you the nickname himself, yeah, this is going to be the kid that's going to succeed David. He's going to be the next one. Now, all these events still have to play out. And a lot of points along the way, it looks like Jed is never going to have a chance to take the throne. But you and I know something that the people going through the story didn't know. And probably this is the reason why Mom complains to King David when Adonijah tries to take over near the end. She's like, don't you remember God sent us this nickname? Jedediah, beloved, chosen of the Lord? He's the guy. He's the one you want to be the next king, not these other guys. So that's what I got cut off saying. And this is how storytellers use names sometimes to foreshadow what's going to happen in the story. And if you're paying attention and if you do a little bit of research on what some of these names mean, especially when the text seems to imply that the name is really important here, it can really give you an insight into where the story is headed. Then, of course, if you read the next 12 chapters, you'll get there too. It's not like this is some secret that if you miss this, you won't figure out what happened. No, I'm not trying to be so weird about this that, if you don't catch every little detail, you'll never know what the Bible means. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just trying to say that if you're paying attention, you can know where the story is going before it gets there. So that when it gets there, you go, oh yeah, I saw that coming. And maybe you just feel better about yourself. And that's what I'm trying to do, is make you feel better about yourself. So I'm trying to give you these little hints. All right, so hopefully by now you've gone to fbchh.org and you have looked at the new notes and you maybe have it open there in front of you. Let me talk about another way that biblical storytellers use foreshadowing, and it's through what I'm calling dialogue, okay? So when the characters speak in the story, sometimes they'll say something early on in the story, and that thing early on turns out to be predictive of what actually happens in the story. All right? And the first example I want to give you is from 1 Samuel chapter 14. Okay? So 1 Samuel 14, and if you don't know anything about this story, this is one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. Okay? 1 Samuel 14. This is the chapter. I didn't mean to do that. 1 Samuel 14 is the chapter where you realize that if Saul's son Jonathan had become the king of Israel instead of David, the country probably still would have been pretty okay. Because Jonathan, it turns out, is a really, really good dude. Like, Jonathan is, in many ways, more noble than David is. And yet God chooses David. So this is Jonathan's moment to shine, okay? And basically, there's a war with the Philistines because this is a big problem in the kingdom of Saul. Verse 1 of 1 Samuel 14 says this. One day, Jonathan the son of Saul said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron, just in case you were wondering where he was. The people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on the one side and a rocky crag on the other. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Sinai. The one crag rose on the north in front of Mishmash, and on the other on the south in front of Geba. All right, so you're getting a sense? A lot of cool names there. That's why you pay me the big bucks, is to pronounce those names. Even if I do it wrong, you'll never know. But here's the deal. Jonathan is in wartime. His dad Saul is hiding out in the caves over here. The Philistines have an army over here. And the Philistines have the tactical advantage. They have the high ground. They have these two crags, these two kind of like rocky mountain faces that are sort of keeping it so that anybody who wants to get to them has to go right through the middle, and they have to go uphill. Okay, that's death. If you're an army and you're trying to take a piece of land, that is a recipe for losing a lot of men. And so Saul isn't doing anything. He's sort of just frozen. He's kind of in place going, what do I do? Jonathan wakes up one day and says, "Hey, let's go over there," to his armor bearer. And his armor bearer says, "Sure, why not? Let's go with him." And then we have this really interesting verse. And this is why we know Jonathan was a man of extreme faith and a great deal of wisdom, even though this seems like a crazy, crazy thing to do. Verse 6, Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." What does Jonathan reveal about what he understands about war from that passage? What do you see there? You see anything? What does Jonathan believe about fighting? Okay. Maybe you're like, that was so obvious. Did you really want me to say that? Yes. What is the numbers, right? We got how many people going to attack the Philistines? This is really not a trick question. 2. Thank you. There's 2. Jonathan and his armor bearer, who, by the way, is called an armor bearer because he doesn't have armor of his own. He carries Jonathan's armor. Okay? He doesn't have a sword. He doesn't have a weapon. He's just the guy who carries the stuff for the guy who has that stuff. All right? So you have one guy who's armed, one guy who has armor, one guy who is not armed, one guy who doesn't. So you have 2 fighters, but you really only have one weapon. Going to take the high ground from an army, a garrison of, let's just be conservative and let's say hundreds. Right? Hundreds of enemies. And they're on the high ground, and they're waiting for this kid to climb up the rocks to them. It's like from The Princess Bride. You remember that? When you have the man in black chasing them up the cliffs of insanity, and Inigo gets to the top, and he's got his sword, right? And he's waiting for the man in black, and finally he gets really tired of waiting for him, and so he throws down a rope to help him get up so he can fight with him. You know, if you have the high ground, you have the advantage. If he wanted to, he could throw a rock, knock the guy off the wall, and that's the end of the battle. But he wants to do it differently. Well, it's the same way here. Jonathan has to climb up a cliff to get to where these guys are. Don't you think that at some point when he's climbing over the edge, somebody could be there with a hammer and just go, bam, and that's the end of the fight? It could be that. It could be very simple. In fact, when Jonathan, he doesn't even try to sneak up the cliff. He goes to the bottom of the cliff, yells up to them, hey, I'm coming to kill you. He literally does this. They laugh at him, they mock him and say, come on up, we want to show you something. And I'm guessing it's the kind of thing that Jonathan would see once and then probably never see again, right? That's their mindset. They're going to teach this punk kid a lesson. They're going to let him climb up, and then they're going to just annihilate the guy. Well, he gets up on top, and he starts wiping these guys out. He starts like killing all the Philistines that come to attack him. And then his armor bearer, who doesn't have a weapon, picks up one of the weapons of the dead guys, and he starts getting in on the action. And then all of a sudden it's 2 people. And the Bible says that there was a panic of fear that was struck through the entire garrison of hundreds, and they start running away from 2 guys. And then Saul wakes up in the cave, goes, where's Jonathan? And they go, oh, the Philistines are running away. And then all of a sudden, all of his guys join the battle, and they chase the Philistines, and then the story goes on from there. But the key thing I want to show you, besides the fact that this is a really cool story that I wish we had more time to talk about, is that Jonathan, before he starts the battle, proves that he understands something about warfare. What he understands about warfare is that God always wins, right? He has figured this out. This is hard to learn when you're a soldier, a fighting man, and you know what the odds are, okay? The odds are not in their favor. This is almost Hunger Games level odds here. This is bad. But Jonathan understands that it doesn't matter how many people are on God's side. If God is on your side, you will win. And so he takes a crazy step of ridiculous faith because he says this in verse 6, right? Let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. Nothing can stop God. So let's go try it and see if God will work for us. And turns out God does. He powerfully uses them to turn the tide of this entire battle. Jonathan's words there, his dialogue, signal to the reader, that's you and me, I think this is going to go okay. I think Jonathan understands what's about to happen. Now, as Jonathan's climbing up the cliff, does he know proof, have absolute a certainty that it's going to turn out well for him? He doesn't. He says the Lord might work for us. In other words, I'm not going to put God on the hook just because I come up with a stupid idea. But if my stupid idea is actually a God idea, it's going to work. So let's go try it and see what happens. Jonathan doesn't have 100% certainty as he's climbing up the cliff, but he understands how these things work. And so do we as the reader. And his words, the dialogue there, signals to us, gives us a hint about how the story is going to turn out. And if you're following the blanks, and I'm sorry, I just skipped the blanks. Let me go back. A character may say something early in the story that is a hint of how the story is going to turn out. They're going to say something early that gives us a hint of how the story is going to turn out. And Jonathan's words here clearly are giving the reader a hint. And honestly, probably giving the armor bearer a little bit of hope, right? Because here's the poor armor bearer. He's like, I don't even have a weapon to defend myself. I'm stuck. I'm following you because I'm your servant. And Jonathan's like, dude, chill. Relax. If God wants to win this battle, he's going to win. It doesn't matter if it's just the two of us. And so the armor bearer's like, okay, I'm on board with that. And he turns out to be a big hero, just along with Jonathan, those two guys. Does that make sense? Using words to foreshadow where this is going. Okay. The second one I want to show you is from Genesis 22, and I won't go into as much detail because this one is much more familiar. Genesis 22 is the story of Abraham and Isaac when he's supposed to sacrifice him. You remember that story? Kind of a weird story. We talked about it back during my Abraham series back in the day. But it says this in verse 1 of Genesis 22, verse 1 says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. And that kind of launches this story. And what I would think would be a normal reaction as a parent would be to like either disobey God's command, because that's like a scary command, right? Or to at least delay it as long as possible, right? Slow it down, take your time. Wait for the trees to grow and then chop them down, Instead, he runs right out, the text says, and he assembles everything and immediately begins to obey and goes to the land of Moriah. Boom, goes to the mountain. Now, here's where Abraham, though, signals with his words that he thinks this is going to turn out differently than what we think as the reader. Okay? Because as we think as the reader, we know God is testing Abraham, but we're also like, man, this is kind of a scary thing. And then it says here, verse 4, right? So this is after they've assembled everything and they started on the journey. Verse 4 says, on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Verse 5, then Abraham said to his young men, right? Because he had some guys with him to help him kind of with all the supplies. It says, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and then what does he say? And we will come back to you, or we will come again to you. Now, wait a minute. He was told by God that he's going up and only one person is coming down, right? Because he's supposed to sacrifice his son. What does Abraham show with his words right there? What does he show? He doesn't think God's going to make him go through with it. And maybe that's the secret as to why he was in such a hurry to get there in the first place and obey so quickly. He is convinced God can't possibly want me to go through with this. But I'm going to come through. I'm going to obey. I'm going to do exactly what God wants me to do. We know he gets all the way to the point of raising the knife, okay? So it's not like he's going there going, nothing's going to happen, and he's cocky about it. He's very serious about this. But he says to his young men, the boy and I are going to come back. So he has faith of some kind that somehow Isaac's going to be spared. And then, so that's one example of foreshadowing right there, right? He's foreshadowing to us, the reader, the boy's going to come back. Isaac's not going to die. But then Isaac asks him the question that is probably the most logical question. He's like, Dad, we got the wood. We've got some flint for the fire. We've got all the stuff we need. Dad, did we forget to bring one of our sheep for the sacrifice? And look at verse 7. Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? Right? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And apparently Isaac is cool with that. He's like, oh, okay. God will provide the lamb himself. Now, how does the story play out? It's literally exactly what happens. Abraham is willing to obey. He picks up the knife. He's got it right over the throat of his own son. And the angel goes, whoa, 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 nope, 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 nope. That's cool. That's as far as you need to go. Now I know that you fear me. Now I know that you take me seriously. Now I know that you have faith in me. You trust me. You are willing to give me your most precious possession. I get it. Abraham, I'm going to bless you. And then he says, look over there, Abraham, in the thicket. And there's a ram caught in the thicket. Don't know how it wandered there. Abraham doesn't know. Abraham doesn't care. All he cares about is that as he predicted, as he foreshadowed with his words, God provided the sacrifice for himself. Now, the really interesting thing, if you want to send echoes ahead, because this is one of the stories that gives us echoes of the death of Jesus, doesn't it? The sacrifice of the Son, and how the ram took the place of the Son was able to live, and the ram had to die. The Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Isn't it amazing that God not only provided the sacrifice for Abraham in his situation, but God also provided his own sacrifice for the sins of humanity as well. It's a really kind of a cool, long-range foreshadowing, I think, of Jesus who would come as God to be his own sacrifice for us. Crazy, really, really cool stuff. So that's two examples of how sometimes these stories use dialogue to foreshadow where the story is going. Jonathan says, hey, God might do this because he can win any battle he fights. Abraham goes, the boy and I are going to come back. I'm confident of that. And also, God's going to provide for himself his own sacrifice, and then the story plays out exactly like that. Okay? The third one is, I'm just going to touch on it really quickly before we dive into the next thing. In John 11, it's really funny. One of the themes in the Gospels, which I really am enjoying as I'm reading them a lot more often for this series that I'm doing, is that the disciples are pretty clueless, okay? They don't get it. They try, and you got to give them the college, the high five for trying. And good job, guys. You were almost there. Peter, I want to defend you. Jesus takes a sword, slices off the guy's ear. Jesus kind of like, no, that's kind of not what I had in mind. He heals him, rebukes Peter, right? It's like the disciples are kind of clueless. And if you want a really funny interaction between Jesus and the disciples, look no further than John chapter 11. Okay, now it's funny from a certain perspective. Now I don't want to take this lightly because in the story a man dies, okay? So death is a part of the picture, but even in the middle of that there's some humor here that a lot of times we miss, okay? So here we go. John 11 verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and his sister Martha. Now we know those two because they used to kind of have their home open to Jesus whenever he was in town. He could stay with them. Okay, we see Jesus at a dinner party at their house. Remember, Martha gets really mad at her sister because she's listening to Jesus teach instead of helping her prepare. So they were friends. Verse 2, it was Mary, by the way, who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So this is somebody who has a deep relationship with Jesus. Verse 3, so the sisters sent to him saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. Now, if you don't see the little request hidden in that statement, you're really not paying attention, right? They're not just saying, I just want to give you an update. My brother's sick. You love him. Like, there's also that little manipulative, like, hey, are you going to do something about this, right? You're the healer. You're the master. You're the one sent from God. You're the Messiah. Surely you can come and heal my brother like you've healed hundreds and maybe thousands of other people. And then verse 4, but when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, what's Jesus doing right there? He's using his words to foreshadow where this story is going. Now, Lazarus is still sick at this point when Jesus gets the word. This decision is not going to lead to death. Now, the funny thing is that the story he does die. But does the illness lead to death in the end? It leads through death to life again, to new life. And Jesus uses it as an opportunity to teach about the fact that he is the Lord, not just of life, he's the Lord of death. And he can snatch life from the very jaws of death. Okay, so this is a big lesson he has to teach his disciples. It's a big lesson he has to teach us. especially those of us who are humans who are fearful of death, which is all of us to some extent or another. Jesus says, this illness is not going to lead to death. Now, let's keep going here. Now, verse 5, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. In other words, Jesus isn't playing with them. He's not playing games with them. He didn't delay on purpose because he wanted to hurt them. But, verse 6, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And in that time, verse 7, after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? This is a logical question, right? Let's go back to Judea. Yeah, the last time I was there, they wanted to kill me. But this time we're going to go back. And the disciples are confused about this. Verse 9, Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. And if you're like me, you go, what? Like, what does that have to do with like anything? Like, I don't understand. And again, when you get confused, join the forces of the people in the story, because the disciples are clearly confused about what is about to happen. Okay, so here we go. After saying these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. Now, okay, let's just keep reading. Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. They're consistently interpreting Jesus' words in like the most obvious possible way, right? Asleep? Oh, he fell asleep. Look at what they say, verse 12. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Yay, he's sleeping now. That means that everything's going to be okay. And then Jesus says, verse 14, then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. Do I need to be a little more clear with you people? Can you not handle a little bit of metaphor, a little bit of figurative language, a little bit of nuance here? Lazarus has died, right? And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So it's like, okay, we heard he was sick. It's been 2 days. We're going to go to Judea, which is going to take a couple days to get there. And Lazarus has already died. And then the disciples, because they finally got it right, verse 16. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. And they're probably referring back to when Jesus was going to get stoned by the people for going there. It's like, let's go, and if Jesus wants to go, I don't know why he's going. Lazarus is dead, but let's go, and we'll die with him. So they're still kind of clueless to this whole thing. And then you have the story that's very beautiful, very moving, very, very personal about the relationship between Jesus and Mary and Martha, and how he helps them process their grief, how he brings Lazarus back to life. But the key thing I want to point out for you there is that Jesus, at the front end, he lets his disciples know how this story is going to play out. But he uses some figurative language. They don't totally get it, and they kind of have to go through it to be able to understand it. Jesus like, look, I'm glad that I didn't go initially, because you're going to really learn the lesson by going through this. But those of us who are the readers don't have to go through it, because he already told us. He used foreshadowing to let us know how the story is going to end up. And then, of course, we know Lazarus is raised from the dead and all the amazing things that come after that. So, again, 2 examples from the Old Testament, 1 example from the New Testament. The biblical storyteller loves to let you know where this is going if you're paying attention, to the story. Okay? So that's dialogue. That's using dialogue to foreshadow where you're going with the story. Verses 9 and 10. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm prepared to comment on those. Right. To be honest with you, I'm not sure exactly what Jesus was getting at there. I'm sure that if I saw it from the right angle, it would make sense, but I'm still wrestling with that. I think the point Jesus is trying to make, I don't know. I'm not going to say anything. Because the temptation for people like me is to just throw an idea out there, whether I've thought it through or not, and I'm going to try to think it through before I do that, because later on, when I realize... Maybe for a Q&A. Yeah, I'm not sure that's going to help for the Q&A either, but we'll try. Okay, so let me give you one more example about how foreshadowing works. And this is interesting, and it does require a little bit of coming with me on this journey, right? So you promise you'll buckle your safety belts and come with me on this. Don't give up on me right away. All right, here's a kind of thing. So we've talked about they use the names can be a foreshadowing, right? The dialogue, what they say, could be a foreshadowing. And then I also want to give you another way that they use foreshadowing. Remember, I threw it on the ground over here. And it's called type scenes. Okay, now, this is not immediately obvious, so stick with me. I think this will make sense. What is a type scene? Let me fill in some blanks for you here. A type scene is a recurring scene that signals an important or an impending significant event, okay? So, a type scene is a repeated scene. In other words, the same thing happens again and again and again. And each time it happens, it's a signal to the reader that something important is about to happen, right? Now, let me give you some examples from modern day life, and you'll hopefully start to grapple with what I'm talking about. Think about this. You're watching a Western, if anybody does that anymore. I think probably some of my viewers do. You're watching a Western, and you see a tumbleweed blow across in a deserted town. And there's two guys standing in the street, facing each other across a distance of like 100 paces. What is about to happen? Do you need to know anything at all about the two guys? Do you need to know about why the streets are deserted? Why is there a tumbleweed? All that stuff. But every time a tumbleweed blows through and there's these two guys standing in the street facing each other, you don't have to know what's on their hip. You know there's about to be a shootout. Why? Because that's how Westerns work, right? A Western, when a tumbleweed goes by and there's two guys facing each other across a deserted street, that's code for we're about to have a shootout here. And that's when the most exciting parts of the movie generally are, right? Who's going to survive? Who's going to be quicker on the draw? And that's all unknown. But you know there's going to be a shootout, and you know it's going to be an important turning point in the story, the shootout, right? That is a type scene. And whenever it's repeated, it sends a signal to you. If you push pause on the movie at that point or push stop and said, what's about to happen? You know enough about Westerns to know what's about to happen. Two guys, and maybe they got a posse, right? Each one of them has a posse hiding, and they're all going to be shooting at each other. And that's going to be the climax of the film. You just know that. Why? Because that's how Westerns work. All right, let me give you another example. So, and I know April Kane's not going to love this when we're talking about movies. I apologize. But if you're watching a movie and one of the characters says, it's quiet here, too quiet, what is about to happen? Any ideas? The monster is about to jump out because the monster apparently is contractually obligated to wait until the person in the story is nervous enough to say, it's quiet here, too quiet. And that's when the thing jumps out of the things, right, out of the shadows to grab you, right? Now, how do you know that's going to happen? Because you've watched enough monster movies or enough scary movies to know that they like to create this sense of dead silence, quiet, ominous, what's about to happen before they do the jump scare, right? You can see it coming. You know it's coming because that's how scary movies work. Or how about this one? You're watching a Star Wars movie and you hear one of the characters say, I've got a bad feeling about this. Look it up. It's in every single Star Wars movie. In fact, in the last one, they made fun of the line because somebody starts to say, I've got a bad feeling about this, and the other characters turn and shush the guy because they know that as soon as somebody says, I've got a bad feeling about this, what's about to happen? Something bad is about to happen to everybody in the story. And that's just a signal. It's a Star Wars signal to those of us who understand Star Wars movies that something is about to go down, right? Something is about to happen. Okay, let me transition. Okay, this is sort of like the other one with a scary movie. Suppose you're watching a movie and there's a teenage girl who's babysitting in somebody's house. And she's sitting there watching TV because the kids are in bed, and she hears a door squeak and close in the deserted house behind her. What is about to happen? You know what's about to happen, right? Is it a mystery what's about to happen? What's about to happen is the bad guy is in the house and he's about to try to kill the girl, right? That's just what happens in scary movies. When you hear the creaking of the door close, you know something is about to happen. It's a type scene. Let me go transition to those of you who like Hallmark movies, right? Because those of you that make fun of us for liking movies, love you some Hallmark movies. I get it, okay? When a girl has a relationship problem in a Hallmark movie and then bumps into this really cute, annoying guy 10 minutes into the movie, what is going to happen in the next hour and 20 minutes? They're going to fall in love and probably get married, and it's probably going to have fireworks in the background, and every tension and every plot problem is going to be resolved. Those two are going to make it. How do you know? They just met each other. They just bumped into each other. She even thinks he's annoying. If you know how romantic comedies work, you know that the good guy, the guy that she's going to end up with, always is annoying at first and always is introduced at a weird point early in the story, right when she's in the middle of a difficult relationship with the guy who she's already a boyfriend, who's already her boyfriend. It's just the way romantic comedies work, okay? And every time you have somebody bump into somebody, oh my goodness, knocks over all of her stuff and he has to help her pick them up or whatever the weird way is that they meet each other, it's a signal to those of you who have watched romantic comedies before. There's your guy. I hope you like him because he's the one you're ending up with, right? It's just the way romantic comedies work. Well, here's the thing. Let me transition now, okay? Let me transition into Bible stuff here. There are certain things that tend to recur, happen over and over again in biblical stories. And when they happen, it's a signal to the smart reader about how the story is going to resolve itself. Now, here's the most common example in the Bible, and the one that I think will help you to see it the best. And we're going to start with it today, and we'll finish with it next week, okay? The most common example of this that I can give you that I think will help make this whole idea of a type scene make sense is when we talk about the difficult subject, but it's a prominent one, especially in the Old Testament, a prominent subject, and it's barrenness, okay? No, not like the Baroness that fell in love with the guy in Sound of Music. That's different. Barrenness, where someone is not able to have a child, okay? There are several examples, key examples in the Old Testament of women who are unable to have children. And so here's the way this works. Turn to Genesis chapter 11, okay? Genesis 11, to the very first example of this. Genesis 11. And probably if I were to ask you, who would you guys think is the first example in the Bible of a woman who is barren? Who are we talking about? The very first. Sarai, okay? Now, she's also pretty famous, at least within our circles, right? Maybe somebody just reading the Bible wouldn't know who that is. She gets a new name later, which means what? Which is what? Not means, just what is it? Sarah, right? So she starts off as Sarai. She ends up as Sarah. Who is she married to? Abram, who later on becomes... Thank you. I know, but I need your help here. That's fine. That's what I like it when people answer as well. That's why I do this thing. All right, so here's the first example. And if you know anything about how stories of barrenness work, you already know how this is going to play out. Okay? But let's assume that we haven't read the stories before, right? So you come to Genesis 11, verse 29, right? It says, and Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now, verse 30, Sarai was barren. She had no child. No child. And apparently it's not just that she doesn't have a child, it's that there's really no hope or prospect of one being born. It just seems like from the story that that's not the natural expectation of what's going to happen in this story. And then the next several chapters, right, are the outworking of this particular problem, because God has made promises to Abraham. And those promises all involve descendants. So if he can't have a son or a child through Sarah, how are God's promises going to come true? And friends, this is a big, big problem in the biblical text. If Abram doesn't have any kids, then this is going to be great. He'll have a nice life, but then when his life is over, that's just the end of the story. And of course, God has reached into his life and chosen him to be the beginning of a nation that's going to bring salvation to the entire planet. This is a big, big deal. And so following Sarai's personal problem of not being able to have a child is the dominant theme of the rest of Abram's story, right? So they think, well, maybe it's not through Sarah. Maybe I'll have one of my slaves marry Abraham, and maybe the child will come from the slave. That turns out to not go so well. All of a sudden now you have an Ishmael, a descendant, who is now a rival, and God says, no, I meant Sarah. She's the one that's going to have the child. Abraham hears about that and he laughs. He's like, come on. This is just not going to work. We've been trying for years. It hasn't worked. She's getting old. I'm getting old. And God's like, dude, I know what I'm talking about. It's Sarah. Sarah hears about it. Sarah laughs. She's like, come on. I had my chance. It's over. It's all done. What we are prepared, what the characters in the story have resigned themselves to is hopelessness. This is not going to happen. Even the heroes in the story don't know how this is going to work. And in fact, not only do they not know how it's going to work, they don't believe God's going to fulfill his promises. They just don't think he will. Until she gets pregnant at 89 and gives birth to a son at 90. And everybody in the text is just doing this. Like, what? It is the opposite, the exact opposite of what you expected, right? This is a tragedy. A story of barrenness, we've been prepared to think, is a story of tragedy. Oh, that's so sad. Oh, God's promises, I guess, aren't going to be fulfilled. I guess the story ends here. And when God tells a story about a barren woman, the first one especially, he is communicating to everybody, you're expecting tragedy, but here's what I'm going to deliver, a miracle. Now, who's the child that's born to Sarah? What's his name? What's his name? Remember? We just talked about him. It means he laughs. It's Isaac. You knew the answer too. Isaac. Isaac means he laughs. All right? It's an ironic name. It's a name that makes you go, I can't believe I didn't trust that God was going to do this. I can't believe it. I can't believe this child is here. I can't believe I'm holding my baby boy in my old age. I thought this was done. I thought it was over. I thought it was hopeless. I thought it was finished. And God's like, well, I know you thought that, but let me just tell you what I'm trying to do in this story. I'm trying to sneak a miracle in there, and the child that is born is going to be a significant child in this story. He's going to be the one that the story continues through. He's the child of promise, and he's going to have sons, and they're going to have sons, and eventually Jesus is going to be born, and then everybody is okay. And it all comes through this boy named Isaac. Because we are conditioned to think that one of these stories is a story of tragedy, when God says, no, this is a miracle story I'm about to tell you. But then, that's one person, right? You kind of go, okay, that's one person's story. Cool. Well, the next person who is barren happens to be Isaac's wife, Rebekah. And you're like, hold on a second here. That's just weird, right? What are the chances that in succeeding generations, these important men, in the sense of important to God's plan, Abraham and Isaac, both marry women that are barren? Like, what are the chances? Don't you feel like as a family you'd be like, come on, look at what we went through with Abraham and Sarah, and now we're going through this again. And what does Rebekah do? That's Isaac's wife. Rebekah goes to God. She's like, God, what's going on? Isaac prays on behalf of his wife, Rebekah. And let's look at the next story here. Okay, here we go. All right, I skipped a couple things because that's what I do. That's what I like to do. All right. If you're following along in your notes, and I know you guys here don't have any of these notes unless you're looking at them online, but those of you that are following along at home, okay? So first, the first biblical example is Sarai. I don't know if that's filled in as a blank or not. Her son, with the arrow on the out here, is Isaac. Sarai has Isaac. And then it says some questions. Is the character notified that she will have a child? Sarah. She is. She's notified by the angels, remember, that come to Abram and say, hey, this time next year, your wife's going to have a baby. Right? So this is an angelic appearance. God himself in some form appears to Sarah and says, you're going to have this child. God, accompanied by two angels, tell her, hey, you're going to be pregnant. Does she end the story barren? Sarah. At the end of the story, is it a tragedy that talks about how sad life is and how broken life is? No. She ends the story with a child in her arms. And is the child that is born significant to the story? Yes, he's the child of promise, and all the promises of God are going to flow from him throughout the succeeding generations, okay? So here's what I want to suggest to you. Sarai here becomes the template. She is the first example of what God is doing when he tells a story about a barren woman. He's telling a story of hope and miracle in the midst of tragedy. And from now on, whenever you see a barren lady in the scriptures, instead of programming yourself to believe this is a story of tragedy, God is trying to program you through Sarah's story to believe that this is going to be a story of hope, a story of miracle, a story of deliverance, a story of how great and powerful God is. Okay? So now let's go to Rebekah in Genesis 25. It's a very short description of her barrenness, but it's right there. Genesis 25. Verses 19 through 21 says, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. Verse 21, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was what? Barren, or unable to have children. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So in this situation, is the character notified by somebody else that she will have a child? Not exactly, right? But how does she come to have a baby? What happens in order for that baby to be born? Yes, there's an intercession. So there's no announcement, right? There's no announcement. They see a problem. They go to God. Isaac says, God, please, can I please have a child? And God decides yes. And so she ends her life with at least 2 children, right? And their names are whom and whom? Jacob and Esau. Now, Dan, make sure you give me an idea of when we're getting close to the end so that I don't do to everybody what I did last time. All right, I am probably done. We'll come back to Jacob and Esau next week. Love you guys. See you later. Bye-bye.